Once again, let's skip any long intros and get straight into the benchmarks. We're looking at the generational uplift of the 3070 Ti versus the 4070 Ti. Why are we looking at Fortnite? Well, because this is the only game that is currently updated to Unreal Engine 5 with the new features like the Lumen lighting system, which is software ray tracing, looks excellent. It also has a hardware accelerated version, which we're looking at currently in this clip, which improves the lighting a bit more and also takes a bit more of a performance penalty. We also have things like Nanite, allowing a lot of objects to stream in smoothly. All of that, we'll talk more about it, but what are we seeing here? We're seeing the 4070 Ti struggling to barely get around a 60 FPS average, and the 3070 Ti averaging around 41. If you're looking at the frame rate counters, the left one is the instantaneous frame rate, the middle is the average, and the one on the right is the 1% lows. So we're seeing about a 61 FPS average here for the 4070 Ti versus 43 on the 3070 Ti by the end of that particular benchmark run. Now, that was with the hardware ray tracing turned on, so now we're trying turning it off to see what kind of performance difference this makes. You could also jump back and forth in the clips if you want to look for any visual differences. They're subtle, but they're there. And here we're seeing both GPUs performing better, with the 4070 Ti now consistently above 60, although this hasn't made a huge performance difference, and the 3070 Ti is closer to the mid-40s, so the 3070 Ti especially is probably going to want to look at lower settings. Now, if you're looking at some of the other stats available up there, you can see the GPU utilization, the temperatures. The 3070 Ti here is the Founders Edition cooler, which you can see here does struggle quite a bit on the 3070 Ti. Now, what are we looking at now? We're looking at the high settings. We've now turned hardware ray tracing off and gone down to the high settings. So this leaves Lumen enabled, but at reduced settings, reduces a bunch of other settings as well. Nanite's still on, all of that. Now we can see the 3070 Ti is able to deliver over 60 frames per second, and the 4070 Ti is a higher refresh rate experience, averaging a little bit over 90 frames per second, which for me personally is where I want to be in a first-person game for things to really feel smooth, and kind of everything above 90 for me is just kind of good, but maybe unnecessary. And I know some of you guys are like, what, Fortnite's a competitive shooter and all that. Like, remember, we're using Fortnite as a stand-in for Unreal Engine 5 performance, not the, not really testing Fortnite itself. It's just the only game we have available. Here I wanted to look at what if we used upscaling on the 3070 Ti to see if it could catch up to the 4070 Ti. This game doesn't feature DLSS, at least currently, but it does have temporal super resolution, which is the upscaler built into the Unreal Engine. We're looking at the 3070 Ti with the quality setting versus the 4070 Ti at native, so this is not apples to apples comparisons. Now the 3070 Ti has basically caught up and slightly passed the 4070 Ti in performance, but again, they're not delivering an apples to apples experience there. They were delivering a, one was upscaled, one wasn't. So now I thought we'd look at 1080p, because I know some people might have, a 1080p monitor going for high refresh rate competitive games and still buy pretty high-end GPUs, that sort of a thing. So here we're seeing the 3070 Ti is around 60 FPS. It does dip below, especially in the 1% lows. Trying to max it out at epic settings with hardware RT on. The 4070 Ti is up over 80 FPS. And the 4070 Ti is at a 43% lead over the 3070 Ti. So if you're looking at those percentages in the bottom middle there, that's what I'm telling you is at the end of the benchmark run, I divided the average result for each GPU, and that's what those percentages mean. So you can see the overall percentage uplift. And we're seeing, it looks like always a little bit over 40% lead for the 4070 Ti so far in Unreal Engine 5. Here I wanted to look at 1080p high settings with the hardware RT off, mainly to see, first of all, man, if the 3070 Ti was barely giving us 60 FPS, is this even how is this going to be doing at 1080p in the future Unreal Engine 5 games? And then the 4070 Ti at these settings can give us a pretty high refresh rate experience, which is nice. We're seeing the 4070 Ti 42% faster and giving us over 120 FPS average, whereas the 3070 Ti is still averaging close to 90 FPS. So overall, a much better showing there. But again, it is only 1080p. Now, you could turn the game down to even lower settings, but again, we want to test out Lumen and Nanite and things, and the virtual shadow maps and all of that. So we're leaving that on. So I thought we'd actually check out 4K resolution. And sure enough, both of these GPUs are struggling. We're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 54% lead over the 3070 Ti here, which was a bit unusual, but I would say they're both losing. I think the 3070 Ti is just getting crushed even more. I'm not sure if it is the memory. Remember, 3070 Ti only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but the 4070 Ti, if you look at the memory stat in green, the one on the left is the allocation, the one on the right is what's actually being reported as used by the game, and it didn't seem to be going over 8 gigabytes, but that was an unusual lead, so the 3070 Ti just couldn't handle those settings. The 4070 Ti wasn't doing well either, so I thought I'd turn it down to 4K high settings and turn off hardware RT. So reduced lumen settings, all of that. Now the 4070 Ti is much more playable at over 50 FPS average. The 3070 Ti, though, is still not getting out of the 30 FPS range. And even the 4070 Ti is not getting really anywhere close to a 60 FPS experience here. And while I say we're using this to test Unreal Engine 5, this is an Unreal Engine 5 game that's designed to run at 60 FPS on consoles. Now, granted, not at native 4K. So I'm just saying other Unreal Engine 5 games could be even more demanding than this. I'm sure they will be. Now, like I said, upscaling could be used. So here we're looking at the temporal super resolution at the quality setting on both GPUs. And we're still down at the high settings with no hardware accelerated ray tracing. So now we're seeing the 3070 Ti actually delivering about a 60 FPS experience, and the 4070 Ti is much more comfortable up in the mid-80 range much of the time. So really, I'm not trying to say that neither of these GPUs could be used at 4K, but as we test it throughout this video, we're going to be looking at what compromises to image quality would you have to make in order to use them at 4K. So speaking of which, I don't always do apples to apples comparisons. Sometimes I want to look at okay, so we looked at you could turn down to high settings and use temporal super resolution quality. What if you wanted to stay at the maxed out settings but use upscaling more aggressively? So now we're looking at epic settings with the hardware RT on, and the 4070 Ti has TSR quality, and it's almost able to hit 60 FPS, whereas on the 3070 Ti, even going all the way down to the performance mode, which is upscaling from 1080p and then trying to output a 4K-like image, it's still not hitting 60 FPS. So really, the 3070 Ti just can't max this game out at 60 FPS. 4K even with aggressive upscaling. But let's move on to another game, because while many AAA games will be using the Unreal Engine 5 in the future, some do their own in-house engine, which is what Plague Tale Requiem does. We're looking at it here at its 1440p ultra settings, and we're looking at the 3070 Ti at native and using DLSS quality, whereas the 4070 Ti I'm just looking at native here. One reason there was to show that the 3070 Ti can pretty much catch up to the performance of the 4070 Ti using DLSS quality here, but also that the 3070 Ti, in the more demanding scenes as we get towards the end of this run here, the 3070 Ti, especially as you actually play the game, dips well below 60 FPS at times. Not that that is the end of the world or anything, but I want to show that just using DLSS quality does bump it up here. And the 4070 Ti is getting a 42% lead once again, which is pretty similar to the margin we saw in Unreal Engine 5. Now here I wanted to look at 1080p. We're not going to do a ton of 1080p testing, but we're not going to ignore it here. Especially on a 3070 Ti, you might be considering it as a high refresh rate, kind of future-proof 1080p GPU at this point. Both of them are delivering high refresh rate experiences here. The margin this time is down to about 39%, but again, we were usually seeing low 40s, so 39% advantage for the 4070 Ti isn't that big of a change from what we were usually seeing. Now looking at the 4K ultra settings, so maxing the game out at 4K, we can see that neither GPU is really excelling here. The 3070 Ti is only a little over 30 FPS in this scene, and the 4070 Ti only a little over 40 FPS in this scene. The average is a bit higher because during the close-up shots throughout the little cutscene I was using, the average was higher, but the in other words, it could make sense to use upscaling if you're going to play at 4K here. So with the 3070 Ti, if we go to DLSS performance, we do get more of that over 60 FPS most of the time experience. On the 4070 Ti, I wanted to show two things. One is DLSS quality on the 4070 Ti, which we're seeing in the middle, which gets us, well over 60 FPS into the 70s. But we could also use DLSS quality plus frame generation. Now, frame generation does not help you the same way normal frames do. Please watch my video on it, but this is the only game in my benchmark suite that features frame generation, so I thought I'd show it off. It can definitely improve the motion fluidity, but they're not real frames generated by the game engine, so they don't increase the game's responsiveness. And occasionally there can be image quality issues, although I actually really liked it in Plague Tale Requiem, and I actually left it on when I played Plague Tale Requiem at 4K Ultra, even on my 4090. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump on to Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p Ultra settings to start out with. And here we're seeing, once again, about a 40% lead by the end of the benchmark run when we're comparing averages for the 4070 Ti over the 3070 Ti. Now, Cyberpunk is about 2 years old at this point, but it's still pretty demanding at its Ultra settings, and it's also going to give us a whole bunch of ray tracing settings to look at, which we'll do in just a second here. Since this benchmark runs a bit longer, why don't we look at some of the other stats going on up there? One thing you'll notice is while the 4070 Ti and 3070 Ti have a similar power draw, the 3070 previous generation actually does draw a bit more power. Which I think is interesting considering the large performance gain we're getting at a lower power consumption. And once again, if you're looking at the temperatures, the 3070 Ti is using the Founders Edition cooler, which honestly was a little underperformant for the 3070 Ti, in my opinion. So that's kind of explaining that large, heat difference that we're seeing there. Now, if we kick on the ray tracing ultra settings, both of these GPUs are struggling. But wait, we're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 79% lead over the 3070 Ti. What's going on there? We're used to seeing about 40%. Is it that much better at ray tracing? No, what we're seeing here is the 3070 Ti running into a VRAM limit. So again, look at the green memory, where it shows on the left, the allocation, and on the right, the actual usage. On the 4070 Ti, you see the actual usage going a little bit over 8 gigabytes. And then if you look at the system RAM, which is in blue under CPU, you can see that the 3070 Ti is using a bit more system RAM. So I think what we're seeing here is the ray tracing kicked up the VRAM usage enough that the 3070 Ti is having its memory get used up and spill over into system RAM, which is hurting its performance, and why we're seeing the 4070 Ti with the 79% lead over the 3070 Ti, although both GPUs aren't really performing very well here, which is a little bit, disappointing to see. So one option to try to get things under control, if you want to max out the ray tracing in a heavy ray tracing game like this, would then be to use image upscaling. So this game does support DLSS. So here we're looking at a couple of things. One, we're looking at a like-to-like comparison, which is what the percentage is based off of, which is the 3070 Ti at DLSS quality and the 4070 Ti at DLSS quality, which in those settings, we see the 3070 Ti not over 60 FPS much of the time. Whereas the 4070 Ti is more of a, averaging in the 80s kind of a range and feels pretty good. So if you're willing to use DLSS quality, the 4070 Ti, certainly RT Ultra at 1440p, no real problem as long as you're willing to use DLSS. In the middle, we're seeing the 3070 Ti at the DLSS balanced settings because that was able to more consistently stay over 60 FPS, although the 1% lows certainly do dip below 60 FPS. But again, the percentage difference I'm showing you here is based on the apples to apples, DLSS quality results, where we're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 48% lead, which is slightly better than the low 40s we were seeing in some other settings, but not like the 79% we saw when the memory was an issue. Here we're seeing 1440p RT reflections. So I wanted to look at, okay, so neither of them could max it out at native with ray tracing ultra settings. But when I say RT reflections here, I'm looking at basically set the game to its ultra preset and then just turn on ray traced reflections, but none of the other ray trace settings. Here we see the 4070 Ti actually able to deliver a good experience at native 1440p with the RT reflections, whereas the 3070 Ti is not. I'm not sure if the memory is as big of an issue here. We're seeing a 56% lead, but the memory usage indicators don't guarantee that there's spillover into system RAM on the 3070 Ti. It's hard to say. Either way, getting the 3070 Ti to DLSS quality does still give it a pretty good experience with these settings. But remember, the Ray Traced Ultra setting would also use interior shadows, sun shadows, and some ray traced lighting effects, whereas this is only using the ray traced reflections, which are very impactful to the visuals in this game, but you certainly aren't just totally maxing the thing out. I did want to look at 1080p again here. So at 1080p, Cyberpunk can still give a lot of GPUs some trouble, but it looks like our 3070 Ti is over 100 FPS most of the time, and the 4070 Ti is actually pushing into the 150 or more FPS range, with a 44% lead over the 3070 Ti, which seems to be a more typical result from what we've been seeing here. Now, again, would you use these GPUs for 1080p? Well, I think a lot of people ignore the fact that many people are primarily playing competitive games at high refresh rates. I mean, there's some new like 500 hertz 1080p monitors coming out. Like, I understand that that's a thing. It's not unheard of to pair higher end GPUs with a 1080p monitor, but just because people primarily play those single player games, those competitive games, doesn't mean they won't sometimes kick on a single player game and maybe want to get 150 frames per second or something like that. So that's really what we were looking at here. So I don't want to underserve that part of the market. And then with 1080p RT Ultra, actually, we're certainly not overkilling the performance on either of these. The 3070 Ti is not able to max out the ray tracing this game and stay over 60 FPS, even at 1080p. And we're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 60% lead, which again could indicate either just that it's that much better at ray tracing in this instance, or that something's going on, holding the 3070 Ti back with some kind of VRAM limitation. But either way, the 4070 Ti is able to deliver over 70 FPS average, and even the 1% lows over 60 FPS. So if you were looking at maxing out ray tracing at 1080p on the 4070 Ti, Cyberpunk's one of the most demanding games out there with its RT Ultra preset, and the 4070 Ti seems to be able to handle it, where the 3070 Ti would need to turn down settings or upscale or both, even at 1080p. So, it's a little bit scary to look at how demanding ray tracing can be on games that actually really crank them. Now, here we're looking at 4K again, but notice this is not 4K Ultra, because what I wanted to show you guys here, first of all, we've already established in the previous testing that neither of these GPUs is really a great 4K Ultra GPU. So here I looked at, what if we step down to the high settings, which in Cyberpunk does give you a pretty big performance boost over staying at Ultra. Here we're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 60% lead over the 3070 Ti again, so it's not completely unheard of to see that 60% lead. And we're seeing the overall frame rates, though. The 4070 Ti is close to a 60 FPS average, but it's certainly not a 60 FPS experience. Now, people on a variable refresh rate screen might not really care if they're dipping into the mid-50s and might just call that good. Whereas the 3070 Ti, I think most people would be looking to increase performance here somehow, either by turning down settings further, or by upscaling, or both. So even at 4K high, neither GPU is giving us a 60 FPS experience. Now, that means that one good option here would be to stay at the high settings, but then enable DLSS quality, which really renders the game at 1440p and then uses the DLSS algorithm to include temporal data and motion vectors and the like, to then try to output a 4K-like image with increased performance. Now that we're doing that, the 3070 Ti is giving us more like a 60 FPS average experience, although we saw in more demanding areas like that bar, it did dip a little bit below. And the 4070 Ti is giving us a much, in my opinion, more comfortable 90 FPS average, where on a, if you have a 4K display that goes up past 60, especially in a first-person game like Cyberpunk, like I said, I feel like the aiming and everything, camera movements feel so much smoother in first-person games at 90 FPS compared to 60. But again, they're both having to turn down settings and upscale to get here. And now we're seeing that 43% lead, which seems a bit more typical. So again, wondering if the 3070 Ti was somehow held back by its memory a little bit or something. But anyway, let's move on to the Callisto protocol. So this game certainly is not the most optimized game out there, but it's an Unreal Engine 4 game, which I did want to test out in my benchmark suite. It's also one of the most recent Unreal Engine 4 games, and one of the best looking Unreal Engine 4 games. And this pushes even next-gen consoles pretty far. We're seeing a 47% lead for the 4070 Ti. This is 1440p Ultra, but with no ray tracing enabled. Now, both GPUs are delivering a comfortable average, but the 1% lows look bad on both of them. And that's true on any GPU I test in this game. The benchmark run here is just very spiky, and the performance swings all over the place. So it just kind of is what it is in this game. If we turn the ray tracing on to the maximum settings, we're now 1440p RT Max. We're again seeing about a 43% lead for the 4070 Ti over the 3070 Ti, which we seem to see a lot. Here we're seeing places where even the 4070 Ti dips below 60 FPS, although like I said, the ups and downs are all over the place in this benchmark, and the 4070 Ti is certainly averaging a decent average frame rate. Also, it's having trouble fully utilizing, which I've seen as an issue in this game, where I feel like it might be getting too single-threaded on the CPU when you turn on ray tracing. And yes, ray tracing does increase the CPU load, so you can see the 4070 Ti frequently underutilized, despite being on a pretty high-end system here. Now, I thought it'd be interesting to look down at 1080p with the ray tracing maxed out, just to see what would happen, especially looking at the GPU utilization again. So the 4070 Ti, again, is down, dipping into the 80% range, even the 70% range. We're seeing the 50% range here. It's pretty brutal. So, and I think that explains why we're only seeing a 20% lead for the 4070 Ti over the 3070 Ti, is just that the game is not able to fully utilize the 4070 Ti's potential due to the rest of the, something else limiting it in this game. Like I said, I'm suspicious of a CPU limit where the ray tracing is too single-threaded and is not able to take advantage of the full or much of the CPU at all. And again, to further show off that it is definitely the ray tracing setting that's doing that, if we go down to 1080p Ultra, now both GPUs are doing much better. The 1% lows still look pretty rough at times, especially on the 3070 Ti. But the overall frame rate is very high on the 4070 Ti, and even the 3070 Ti averaging over 100 FPS here. And again, the GPU utilization looks much higher. Again, there are some scenes where it's dipping below 100% on the 4070 Ti, but at a much higher frame rate than we saw that happen when ray tracing was enabled. So I think it does have to do with the programming of the ray tracing implementation on the CPU, if I had to guess what was going on there. Now, if we turn things on to 4K Ultra settings, we're now seeing the 4070 Ti once again with a 44% lead over the 3070 Ti. Once again, that seems to be the most typical result that we see. Now, both of these GPUs struggle in that difficult corridor with all of the slime and gross stuff and whatnot. That's a particularly demanding area. But as we fly through some of the easier little hallway scenes, the 4070 Ti does pick its average up over 60 FPS. The 3070 Ti is averaging lower. This game does feature FSR2. It doesn't have DLSS, but you could upscale on the 3070 Ti and probably pick those frame rates up, but I'd like to just move on. How about some competitive gaming? Let's take a look at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and we'll start out at the 1440p extreme settings, and then we'll also look at turning down the settings to what I think would be more realistic for a competitive player to use. But first, let's look at 1440p extreme to really stress the GPUs, and that'll help, really focus on the GPU performance. And we're again seeing a kind of an atypical result here with the 4070 Ti with a 59% lead over the 3070 Ti. I was curious if this could be GPU RAM limitation, and if you look at the green memory usage, we see the 4070 Ti allocating almost 10 gigabytes and claiming it's using over 7, whereas the 3070 Ti is only allocating less than 7 and using under 6, but with that large gap, and with the CPU RAM a little bit higher on the 3070 Ti, I am wondering if there was something memory related going on there. I think this game might like having more VRAM a lot. But if we go down to the 1440p balanced settings, we're still seeing the 4070 Ti winning by 53% over the 3070 Ti. So it could also just be that this game likes the newer architecture from the 4000 series compared to the 3000 series. There's something about it that it prefers. I believe the 4000 series has a larger cache, so maybe it likes cache. Anyway, we're seeing the frame rates a lot higher here overall. I think this would be more representative of what competitive Call of Duty players might actually use. Now, this benchmark run goes through a multiplayer map. The Warzone 2 maps can be more demanding and can also bring in a CPU limit a lot earlier. So do be aware of that if you're more focused on the Battle Royale side of things. I did also want to look at 1080p, and I even went down to 1080p balanced settings because, like I said, I think if you're using GPUs like these at 1080p, likely you're playing pretty competitively, which means you're probably turning down settings and shooting for very high frame rates. So we're looking at 1080p balanced, and we're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 51% lead, which is, again, still a bit higher than what we were seeing more typically in a lot of those other games. And then the overall frame rates are pretty high for both GPUs. The 3070 Ti would be very at home at a 165 hertz monitor, whereas the 4070 Ti looks like it would be more at home, maxing out a 240 hertz or more monitor, which I know a lot of people would be looking for. So if you're kind of thinking, which of these GPUs could max out my high refresh rate 1080p competitive gaming, at least in this game, it's looking like 165 on the 3070 Ti and a 240 on the 4070 Ti. Kind of makes the most sense. Now, I was curious what would happen if we looked at this at 4K. Although I did go to 4K balanced settings rather than 4K extreme because, again, I'm acknowledging that this is a competitive game. So even if you're playing on a 4K screen, you might, maybe you're mostly interested in single-player titles, but then you do play competitive games and you don't mind turning down the settings a bit in competitive games. Then in this case, we're seeing the 4070 Ti actually giving you honestly, I think for people who don't take it that seriously, if you're getting over 100 FPS most of the time, sure, you could get more of a competitive edge if you turn things down more and whatnot, but I think most people will be pretty happy with that performance if you're not super, super competitive. And even the 3070 Ti is mostly over 70 FPS, although we did see with that big explosion it actually dipping below 60 FPS. And once again, the 4070 Ti has a 51% lead over the 3070 Ti. So this game certainly seemed to favor the newer 4000 series architecture. But what about other games? Well, I took a look at Forza Horizon 5, and we're looking at the 4K Extreme preset, and we're seeing a 54% lead for the 4070 Ti over the 3070 Ti. So it's looking like this is yet another game that, at least at 4K Extreme settings, is preferring the 4070 Ti a little bit more than we saw typically. And once again, if you look at the memory and RAM usage, I think this could be the 3070 Ti hitting up against its 8GB limit. Now, it's giving good overall performance around 60 FPS, a little bit over most of the time. But if you look at the memory allocation on the 4070 Ti, you see 10 gigabytes allocated and 8 gigabytes actually being used. And if you look at the system RAM in blue, there's more being used on the 3070 Ti and less green memory, right, VRAM utilized on the 3070 Ti, indicating to me that I think it could be spilling a little bit over into the system memory and causing some of this larger performance difference here. So by turning it down to 1440p at the extreme preset, we're now seeing the 4070 Ti with only a 45% lead, although that 45% lead is more typical to what we saw in other games. And the other thing I'll mention is that we'll actually see the 4070 Ti GPU utilization dipping below 100% at times, like down into the lower 90% range, which isn't terrible. But also, if you look at its power consumption, it does feel like the 4070 Ti is not being fully utilized here. So in other words, there could be a bit of a CPU limitation at these high frame rates where, both GPUs are delivering very high, good frame rate experiences, but the 4070 Ti is pushing so high that there could be a little bit of a CPU limitation starting to come in and reduce its lead. So I thought I'd look at Vulkan as well. So this is Red Dead Redemption 2, which, despite being a few years old, is still a very demanding game, although, nothing like an Unreal Engine 5 or something like that. But also, like I said, this is a game that you can run in Vulkan. So I did, so we could get some Vulkan performance here. And we're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 39% lead, which, while being slightly on the lower end of what we've seen, again, around 40% uplift did seem fairly typical. I'm not showing you the averages or the 1% lows on this one because this benchmark has several load screens in it. So running my MSI Afterburner through those load screens would mess up the results. So I'm basing the percentage difference off of the average that the benchmark itself reports here at the end, which was basically 90 FPS and 124 FPS respectively. Now I thought we'd look at 4K, and since the 3070 Ti was dipping below 60 FPS at times, obviously one option would be to turn down settings. What I'm using here is the 4K settings, but then I just slid the overall slider to the favor quality side all the way to the right. The 4070 Ti was giving me good enough experience I didn't bother trying upscaling. The 3070 Ti is dipping below 60 enough that I thought I'd also try it out with DLSS quality, which is what you're seeing in the middle. Although when you see the relative performance percentage difference, what you're seeing is the native resolutions compared. So I'm not using the DLSS version in the percentage difference I'm giving you, which is only a 34% lead for the 4070 Ti, which is, again, lower than what we were seeing in a lot of situations, which is interesting to me. And again, I'm basing that off of the average result that the benchmark kicked out for me at the end, because again, I wasn't using my MSI Afterburner through the load screens, all of that, but this is a fairly long benchmark run. Now, I also thought we'd take a look at a DirectX 11 game. So again, trying to get all of our graphics APIs here. God of War being one of the more recent and better looking DX11 titles. We're looking at 1440p Ultra first, and in this case, we're seeing the 4070 Ti with a 37% lead over the 3070 Ti. And both of them are delivering very high frame rates, although do keep in mind that during this opening cutscene, it's a bit easier to run than most of the game, although I'm using it for the side-by-side capture. As Kratos turns this corner and is holding this log, and you would actually get camera control here, the instantaneous frame rates here, 85 and 111-ish, respectively, is more typical of what you'd see in actual gameplay. Those averages are a bit higher, although I'm giving the percentage difference based off of the average at the end of the benchmark run, which again is only 37%. Now, if we kick it up to 4K Ultra settings, I am seeing a 42% lead for the 4070 Ti over the 3070 Ti. Which is, again, a bit more typical of what we saw. So maybe this isn't just a DX11 thing performing a bit lower. Here we're seeing, again, like I said, the more typical result. Once again, with the 3070 Ti dipping below 60 FPS, I did try it out with DLSS quality. And again, that's not used in the average percentage difference I'm giving you, but just for informational purposes, the 3070 Ti is able to get close to the performance of the 4070 Ti if it uses DLSS quality, which at 4K does actually look pretty good, although the 4070 Ti is still faster, even giving the DLSS quality to the 3070 Ti. Now, the last game I was going to look at was Horizon Zero Dawn. This is another game that originated on PS4, and it has a pretty long benchmark run here. I'm just showing you the tail end of it. Both GPUs are doing fine at 4K, but the 4070 Ti is only 25% faster than the 3070 Ti on this benchmark run, which I thought was interesting even at 4K Ultra settings. So it can be a bit hit or miss on the exact percentage difference between the two. All right, so we've seen a ton of benchmarks. We've got an idea of the performance delta between the 3070 Ti and its generational uplift to the 4070 Ti. But let's give some final thoughts on that, as well as the value of the cards. Now, when thinking about the value of the cards, there's both the price new, but some of you might be actually, some of you guys are thinking, should I upgrade from a 3070 Ti? Some of you guys are thinking about, should I buy a 3070 Ti or a 4070 Ti? Well, the MSRP of the 3070 Ti was $600, and it was criticized as being a little overpriced at that because it wasn't a huge uplift over the 3070 with a $500 MSRP. But anyway, we should also think about the current market value of a 3070 Ti, both used and new. Now, I'm looking at Jawa.gg here to look at some sold listings to get an idea of what these things are actually selling for on the used market. And I'm seeing from $475 to $500, sometimes a bit more. So it looks like we're kind of in this $450 to a bit over $500 range. So maybe a market value of $500-ish on the used market. And again, the MSRP was $700. Now wait, I'm at Jawa.gg. They're actually sponsoring today's video. So I should actually talk about this a little bit, because if you are upgrading your GPU, you should seriously consider selling your old hardware to make back some of that money, right? This will offset some of the cost, especially with GPUs getting so expensive. That's actually helping keep the used value of the older cards up higher. So selling them would be a great idea. And you might want to really consider selling on Jawa.gg. And I'll have a link in my description. And yes, I am sponsored by them, but I actually first found out about Jawa through I actually watched a Bitwit video that was not sponsored. He was asked by some of his community to, hey, I've heard about Jawa. They're kind of a new place to buy and sell PC gear. Are they legit? And he built a whole system there and really was pretty happy with the, was actually very happy with the overall service. And one of the best places it could improve is actually just getting more people on there selling. They're very fast growing. And you actually have two options if you want to sell. So you can do the listing yourself, where you manage the listing and pick your price, or you could sell directly to Jawa. And you tell them the GPU model condition, they give you a price within 24 hours, you ship the GPU to Jawa, they receive it, inspect it, and pay you. But again, you can list it and manage the sale yourself as well. Now, overall, this is really cool. They're fast growing. And, you know, if you're concerned about, like, okay, so why sell on Jawa instead of doing something like eBay? Well, eBay does have good seller protections, so does Jawa. So seller protections, we use best-in-class fraud prevention measures so you don't get scammed, but also you get to keep more of your money because eBay takes a huge cut of the sale. So we have some of the lowest fees on the market, so you could compare fees, and again, I think you'll find Jawa a very attractive option. And again, this is, you know, where places like eBay and whatnot are big, like all sorts of things are getting sold there. One nice thing about buying and selling on Jawa is the, it's really gaming focused and really PC gaming focused, which is awesome. So if you want to sell your old GPU, check the link in the description here. But again, we're using this to establish the kind of used market value here, looking at these sold used listings. But if we look at new listings, we could pop on over to PC Part Picker. And a 3070 Ti right now, and PC Part Picker, I know it doesn't find the best deals available and all that. It searches a lot of new price listings. And 3070 Ti's new right now are actually selling for overall, I don't know if they're selling at these prices, but they're listed at over $700. Please don't pay that for a 3070 Ti. Now, as recently as a few months ago, you were able to buy them at their MSRP. I actually bought one for my channel. This was before I was getting review samples. I bought a 3070 Ti for the channel at MSRP from Best Buy. It wasn't super easy, but they were available. And again, that MSRP was $600. So definitely don't think about buying a 3070 Ti new at these types of prices. A 4070 Ti, new right now, one of the things about the 4070 Ti is it's been widely criticized for its high MSRP for a 70 Ti class GPU. So a lot of them have not sold out, despite this video being filmed fairly close to launch. There's a lot of these available in the, this one actually just says notify me, the one's actually MSRP. But a lot of these are actually available. So like new in stock from Best Buy at $830. These are actually available if you go to the site, it's not a mistake. So 4070 Ti's are actually available at around that $800 price point. So now let's start doing some analysis on these prices. So the first thing I've done here on my handy dandy calculator is 800 divided by 600. Why am I doing that? Well, that's the MSRPs, and we get 1.3 repeating. So basically, the 4070 Ti is a 33% MSRP increase compared to the 3070 Ti, right? So it's a 33% generation on generation increase. Now, what that means is, so if you had complete pricing, like value per dollar stagnation, it would be taking the MSRP of the 3070 Ti, which again, I'm going to stress, was criticized as not even being that good of a deal when it was announced at $600. If we multiply that by the 1.333 whatever, basically that would get us to $800. So, but what I'm saying here is, but we got more than a 1.3 repeating MSRP performance uplift. That's the word I'm looking for. So let's think back to our benchmarks that we saw, right? I think the most typical result, and the results we saw in new engines like Unreal Engine 5, was around a 43% uplift. So basically it's 33% money for 33% more money for about 43% more performance if we're just looking at apples to apples comparisons. And that would come out as basically if you multiply the baseline MSRP of the 3070 Ti by the performance uplift, basically the GPUs that are selling at about this mid $850-ish price point are basically just complete pricing stagnation compared to the 3070 Ti. Now, some people, I've seen this in my comment section, some people defending the price of the 4070 Ti by basically saying it gives you about the same, you know, it's just a linear uplift. You get more performance for more money. Why should you get more performance for the same price? Well, why should we? Because that's how PC hardware components have always worked. And that's how CPUs are still working, right? Basically, from generation to generation, you usually get the successor at the same or similar price, but offering a significantly more performance, meaning that when you look at the performance per dollar, you get a more exciting uplift than this. But what I will say is my testing does seem to indicate that the 4070 Ti is slightly more performance per dollar when you compare MSRPs. So at least it has that. It's just a disappointingly low improvement on performance per dollar. And getting a 70 Ti class GPU at $800 just feels really bad overall. Now, further thinking about value, we should get into the fact that the 4070 Ti does have slightly less power consumption and still has 43% better performance, so that's good. We also saw some situations, they were limited, where the performance improvement was more than 40%. And one of the places where we saw that was when the 3070 Ti seemed to be running out of VRAM. The 3070 Ti only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and the 4070 Ti does have 12 gigabytes of VRAM. And while I've heard some people criticizing it as 12 gigabytes of VRAM is too low, you know, the competition offers more gigabytes of VRAM. That's true, but if you aren't running out of VRAM, like VRAM only matters when you run out, okay? As long as you have enough, you're fine. And in all of the testing that I did not see the 4070 Ti coming close to running out of VRAM. Now, maybe depending on the games you play, I've heard like certain games, especially when you mod them, things like that, might have more VRAM usage. And there's also the future to think about. But when you're thinking about is it enough VRAM, think about the 3070 Ti. In the places where it was running out of VRAM was actually places where even if it had enough VRAM, its performance would be low enough anyway that you'd probably turn down the graphic settings. Remember that reducing graphic settings and or using DLSS actually reduces the VRAM. Like with DLSS, you're rendering at a lower resolution, so it does reduce the VRAM. We saw this at 1440p, you know, Cyberpunk RT Ultra, that we saw this huge lead for the 4070 Ti because it seemed like the 3070 Ti was running out of VRAM. Well, yeah, but the 3070 Ti, even the 4070 Ti wasn't getting good playable frame rates at those settings. So I guess what I'm saying is I think the 8 gigabytes of VRAM is a legitimate concern moving forward on the 3070 Ti, although turning down settings, you could probably keep it under control. Whereas the 4070 Ti, I really do think 12 gigabytes of VRAM, while it would be nice to have more, isn't really going to be an issue for many people in gaming workloads. Now, productivity workloads, that's another thing, but if we move to productivity, the 4070 Ti does offer, right, with the new 4000 series GPUs, You are getting the AV1 encoders. Now you're getting that from AMD and Intel as well, but like compared to the 3000 series, the new generation, like I said, is more power efficient, and it does have AV1 encoders, which is really nice if you're going to be live streaming, once live streaming services actually support it. And then for other productivity use cases, it could help some people, but many people aren't going to be using encoders, so it doesn't matter to them anyway. The main generational gaming difference, feature-wise, between the two series is the frame generation for the NVIDIA's 4000 series class. And it's really frustrating that it's locked off of the 3000 series, and people are debating whether that's a real limitation or it's just NVIDIA trying to create reasons to buy the 4000 series. But regardless of whether it's a marketing limitation or a hardware limitation, it is a limitation where only the 4000 series does have frame generation. Now, do you care? Should you pay more money for frame generation? Because NVIDIA is really trying to justify the price of the 4070 Ti using frame generation. So first of all, I wouldn't consider it increased performance. It's increased motion fluidity. And I've done a whole video on this topic, so I don't want to bog down on this. But the main thing is, usually when frame rates go up, you have two major improvements: the fluidity of motion, especially with fast movement, and the input latency. The game becomes more responsive. Frame generation helps the motion fluidity, but it does not help the game responsiveness, and it has a small actual negative input to the input latency, like meaning making it slightly worse. Although I don't really notice the slightly worse thing, but in other words, if you could play the game at 60 FPS, then use frame generation to go over 100 FPS, the input latency will still feel like about 60 FPS, maybe a little bit less, but the motion fluidity will feel more like the 100 FPS, right? So that's how it helps. But in a competitive gaming environment, you probably wouldn't want to use that for the latency reasons. But in a lot of single-player games, I liked it. The only reason why you'd really want to turn it off in a single-player game is image quality concerns. So in certain games, there's problems with HUD elements, and in Spider-Man, he moves super quickly, so I didn't really like how it looked moving over a lot of the fast-moving backgrounds. The AI image would oftentimes look bad enough that it was noticeable to me. But in a lot of other single-player games, like Plague Tale Requiem, I actually really liked using it. And like Witcher 3, and it helps out in CPU-limited situations. So I'm actually very positive about frame generation. I just don't like how NVIDIA markets it as frames that are somehow equivalent to other frames, which they're not, because they don't help the game's actual performance, right? They just help the motion fluidity, which is a good thing, though. Anyway, so I do think it's a selling point. So my overall thoughts here are, first of all, do not buy a 3070 Ti at these price points. Well, a 3070 Ti, right, at these price points. Hey, did one just come in stock a little bit lower? Anyway, and then the 4070 Ti is, it's a better value than the 4080 like price per frame, and better than 3070 Ti, but it's still just very expensive. And I feel like they seem to be sitting on shelves. I think if you wait, it's going to come down. It just has to come down. And I think some of AMD's competition could come down too. So if you're more interested in seeing a comparison against like the 7900 XT, I did a different video on that, so feel free to search my channel, or maybe I'll remember to link it up here. And like I said though, definitely consider buying and selling used. If you want to offset the cost of buying your new GPU, if you have an old one to sell, do think about selling. And like I said, Jawa sponsored this video today, and I really do think it's a really good option to take a look at. Either selling directly to them or listing it for sale yourself on that. So take a look at that, link in the description. Let me know what you guys think about the 4070 Ti, 3070 Ti, all of that. Other cards you'd like me to compare it against, let me know in the comments, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.